Chapter 17. The Guardian Furies. In 1787, at an inn near Moulins, an old man was dying, a friend of Diderot's, whose ideas had been molded by the philosophies. The local priests were baffled. They had tried everything in vain. The good man refused the last sacraments, saying he was a pantheist. Monsieur de Rolbon, who was passing by and who believed in nothing, bet the curé of Moulins that he would take less than 2 hours to bring the sick man back to Christian sentiments. The curé took the bet and lost. Taken in hand at 3 a.m, the sick man confessed at 5 and died at 7. "You must be very good at arguing," said the curé, "to beat our own people." "I didn't argue," replied Monsieur de Rolbon. "I made him frightened of hell." Jean-Paul Sartre, Nausea. Close quote. Whilst abstract expressionism was being deployed as a Cold War weapon, America had turned up an even more potent discovery: God. Religious faith in the moral law had been enshrined in the Constitution of the United States in 1789, but it was during the height of the Cold War that America discovered how useful the invocation of the highest hosanna could be. God was everywhere. He was in 10,000 balloons containing Bibles, which were floated across the Iron Curtain by the Bible Balloon Project in 1954. His imprimatur was stamped on an act of Congress of 14 June 1954, which expanded the Pledge of Allegiance to include the words "one nation under God," a phrase which, according to Eisenhower, reaffirmed the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace and war. He even began to appear on dollar bills after Congress ordained that the words "In God We Trust" become the nation's official motto in 1956. Why should we make a 5-year plan for ourselves when God seems to have had a 1,000-year plan ready-made for us? Too, asked one American historian. Under the terms of this logic, political virtue was to be submitted to a long-standing Christian tradition of obedience to the law of God. By invoking the ultimate moral authority, America acquired an unanswerable sanction for her manifest destiny. Destiny's elect had been taught, like the boys at Groton School, that in history, every religion has greatly honored those members who destroyed the enemy. The Quran, Greek mythology, the Old Testament. Doing in the enemy is the right thing to do. Of course, there are some restraints on ends and means. If you go back to Greek culture and read Thucydides, there are limits to what you can do to other Greeks who are part of your culture. But there are no limits on what you can do a Persian. He's a barbarian. The communists were barbarians. 3. The religious imperative motivated cold warriors such as Allen Dulles, who, brought up in the Presbyterian tradition, was fond of quoting from the Bible for its use of spies by Joshua into Jericho. When the CIA moved into its vast new complex in the Virginian woods in 1961, Dulles arranged for one of his favorite quotes from Scripture to be engraved on the wall of the Langley lobby. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." John 8:32. Henry Luce, the child of American missionaries, was fond of drawing on the same divine reference. The great Christian promise is this: seek and ye shall find. That is the promise and the premise on which American is founded. Luce seldom missed Sunday church or went to bed without first praying on his knees. His wife, Claire Booth Luce, converted to Roman Catholicism after her daughter Anne had been killed in a car accident in 1943. The country's most publicized conversion, it prompted some detractors to derision. According to one widely repeated jape, the Pope interrupted a doctrinal argument with Mrs. Luce when she was American ambassador to Italy to remind her, "But, madam, I too am a Catholic." She claimed credit for persuading Eisenhower to become a Presbyterian in the run-up to the 1952 election campaign. Neither profit nor personal glory motivated Luce as deeply as his missionary urge to improve his countrymen, and he exercised his power in the sincere, if not unanimously shared belief that he knew what was good for them, wrote one early biographer, Point 5. He insisted that the American capacity for successful cooperation is directly related to our country's constitutional dependence on God, and believed that no nation in history, except ancient Israel, was so obviously designed for some special phase of God's eternal purpose. 6. Toulouse, the Cold War was a holy war in which Time Inc. was committed to the dominant aim and purpose of defeating communism throughout the world. Is that a declaration of private war? He once asked Time Inc. executives. And if so, may it not be unlawful and probably mad? Perhaps so, but there are some mighty fine precedents for the declaration of private war. 7. Nowhere was the parallel with the mercenaries of the Crusades, or the private armada of Francis Drake, so powerfully drawn. The theologian most favored by Luce was Reinhold Niebuhr, an honorary patron of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and a Cold War realist who believed that the establishment of a calculated balance of power was paramount, with foreign policy the exclusive responsibility of an elite authority. For members of that elite, Niebuhr was, of course, a congenial authority figure. Martin Luther King, on the other hand, claimed to have learned from him the potential for evil. Niebuhr served up liberal helpings of theology to Time Life readers, winning Sidney Hook's approval for successfully reviving the doctrine of original sin as a political tool and making God an instrument of national policy. 8. Indeed, with the religious imperative insinuating its way into every major Cold War policy plank, the whole edifice of American power in the 1950s seemed to rest on one fundamental, monist proposition: that the future would be decided between the two great camps of men, those who reject and those who worship God. We must not be confused about the issue which confronts the world today. President Truman had warned. It is tyranny or freedom. And even worse, communism denies the very existence of God. 10. The manufacturing of such a concept, which reduced the complexity of world relations to a struggle between the powers of light and darkness, meant that the rhetoric of American foreign policy had come to rest on distinctions which resisted the processes of logic or rationality. George Santayana, writing in 1916, had described the philosophical process by which such distortions come to dominate the historical process. Imagination that is sustained is called knowledge, illusion that is coherent is called truth, and will that is systematic is called virtue. Such distinctions were lost on the young preacher Billy Graham, who amplified Truman's warnings with the theory that communism is masterminded by Satan. I think there is no other explanation for the tremendous gains of communism in which they seem to outwit us at every turn, unless they have supernatural power and wisdom and intelligence given to them. Tormund Mailer inferred a different diagnosis. America's deepest political sickness is that it is a self-righteous nation. 13. It was in this climate of doctrinal dogmatism that Senator Joe McCarthy flourished. In The Crucible, Arthur Miller compared the Salem witch hunts with the McCarthy period to demonstrate a parallel guilt 2 centuries apart of holding illicit, suppressed feelings of alienation and hostility towards standard daylight society as defined by its most orthodox opponents. Without guilt, the 1950s Red Hunt could never have generated such power. The main point of both inquisitions was to establish guilt by public confession, with the accused expected to damn his Confederates as well as his devil master and guarantee his sterling new allegiance by breathing disgusting old vows, whereupon he was let loose to rejoin the society of extremely decent people. A curious feature of McCarthy's Un-American Activities hearings was that they showed less interest in the names supplied than in testing the sincerity of the witness's confession. Leslie Fiedler, who, like his friend Irving Kristol, discovered religion in the early 1950s, described the process as a kind of symbolic ritual when he said that the confession in itself is nothing, but without the confession, we will not be able to move forward from a liberalism of innocence to a liberalism of responsibility. 16. Much drawn to the symbolism of public confession was the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. Elia Kazan, who had named names at a McCarthy hearing in April 1952, had been rewarded with membership of the American Committee, which was now happy to fight his battles for him. Defending Kazan's Actors Studio from the attacks of a hardline anti-communist group, Saul Stein, in Jesuitical mood, argued that Kazan was fulfilling the proper role for anti-communists in the theater, which is that of missionary to their politically backward brethren who have taken much too long a time in appreciating the fact that service to front groups in this country contributes to the power of the Soviet mammoth. 17. Those who sided with the communists in the past ought to be given an opportunity to direct their energies into genuinely anti-communist enterprises and efforts, if that is in line with their present convictions. Riesenstein. Kazan, he said, should be given space to offer the political Johnny-come-latelys an opportunity for redemption in order that their talents might be enlisted against our common enemy. 19. This was not enough to reassure the extreme anti-communist pressure group, Aware Inc., who complained that Kazan was continuing to work with unregenerates like Marlon Brando, Frank Silvera, and Lou Gilbert, and had failed to employ any active anti-communists. 20. The American Committee also saw fit to appoint to its executive body America's most famous informer, Whittaker Chambers, whose testimony had sunk the career of Alger Hiss. Whittaker had elevated the art of snitching to new heights, provoking one senior colleague at Time Life, where Chambers was an editor, to tell him, in Luce's presence, "I think your favorite movie would be The Informer." Solstein wrote excitedly to Chambers that his nomination had precipitated a number of post-midnight anonymous calls threatening to wipe the board members off the face of the earth. "Dear God, I suppose this foolishness will always be with us." He concluded 21. At issue, wrote Chambers in Witness, his 1952 autobiography, was the question whether this sick society, which we call Western civilization, could in its extremity still cast up a man whose faith in it was so great that he would voluntarily abandon those things which men hold dear, including life, to defend it. Presenting himself as just such a David, Chambers got $75,000 for taking up his sling against communism from the Saturday Evening Post, which serialized the book over 8 weeks. "You are one of those who did not return from hell with empty hands," 23 André Malraux told him after reading Witness. With God and Mammon on their side, American anti-communists were able to reap the benefits of what had become a flourishing sub-profession. In Hollywood, the crusade to cleanse American culture of all godless impurities was seized upon by Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, two syndicated gossip columnists who were to moral hygiene what Mrs. Beaton was to a clean kitchen. Richly salaried, they were the guardian Furies, the police matrons planted at the portals to keep out the sinful, the unpatriotic, and the rebels against propriety unworthy to breathe the same pure air as such apostolic exemplars as Louis B. Mayer, Harry Cohn, Jack Warner, Daryl Zanuck, Sam Goldwyn, and a handful of others. The ladies' ferocity towards communism was matched only by their duplication of some of its practices. 24 Hopper and Parsons, though they may not have thought of themselves as such, were militant libertists, the phrase which designated a top-secret campaign on the part of the Pentagon, the Navy, the National Security Council, and the Operations Coordinating Board to insert the theme of freedom into American movies. On Friday, 16th of December 1955, a secret gathering was convened by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss how the idea of militant liberty could be exploited by Hollywood. According to a top-secret report, militant liberty was designed to explain the true conditions existing under communism in simple terms and to explain the principles upon which the free world way of life is based, and to awaken free peoples to an understanding of the magnitude of the danger confronting the free world, and to generate a motivation to combat this threat. 25. The idea was to create a slogan, a political catchword, that most people would have the impression had arisen spontaneously, but which in fact had been intentionally introduced into the culture, explained cultural historian Christopher Simpson. It was a pretty sophisticated propaganda operation for its time. 26. As the basis for a doctrinal campaign, militant liberty was approved at the highest levels. But it was not until the following year that the Pentagon finally found a concrete formula by which to deliver its message. In June and July 1956, representatives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff held several meetings in California with a posse of Hollywood figures dedicated to expunging communism: John Ford, Marion Cooper, John Wayne, and Ward Bond. The meetings, which were held in the MGM office of John Ford, lasted up to 6 hours. According to a memo of 5th of July 1956, Mr. Wayne stated that in his pictures, produced by him, Backjack Productions, the Militant Liberty program would be inserted carefully. To see how this might be done, Wayne invited everyone to his home at 4570 Louise Avenue, Encino, the following evening. After dinner, the movies They Were Expendable and The Quiet Man were shown and studied by Mr. Wayne and Mr. Ford for the manner in which favorable slants for the Navy and free world cultural patterns had been introduced in the two films. 27. At another meeting, Marion Cooper pointed out that a series of films being made by Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney lacked a theme, and that he wished that he had had this, e.g., militant liberty, and further stated that he would put it in the others. It was arranged that Whitney would be briefed accordingly. A successful industrialist, Cornelius Sonny Vanderbilt Whitney shared in the vast Whitney fortune, which had fallen to his cousin Jock to manage. Like Jock, he was also close to the CIA. Their cousin was Tracy Barnes, and more than ready to help it. As a trustee, Cornelius allowed the Whitney Trust to be used as a CIA conduit. He was also part of the team involved in formulating a psychological warfare initiative called the National Security Information Agency. Well known as a producer, in 1933, he went into business with David Selznick, and together they produced A Star is Born, Rebecca, and Gone with the Wind. In 1954, he set up C.V. Whitney Pictures, Inc., and stated, "I want to film what I would describe as an American series to show our people their country and also to make certain that the rest of the world learns more about us." 29. The first picture in the American series was The Searchers, produced at a cost of $3 million and directed by John Ford. During the war, John Ford had been chief of the field photographic branch of OSS. His job was to photograph the work of guerrillas, saboteurs, and resistance outfits in occupied Europe. Special assignments included producing top-secret films which were screened to government leaders. In 1946, he incorporated his own production company, Argosy Pictures. The principal investors, besides Ford and Marion Cooper, were all OSS veterans. William Donovan, Ole Doring, a member of Donovan's Wall Street law firm, David Bruce, and William Vanderbilt. Ford was entirely in sympathy with the idea that the government's intelligence agencies should suggest themes for Hollywood audiences and ask them to leave 6 copies of the Militant Liberty booklet with him and send him a dozen more so that he could pass them on to his scriptwriters so that they can learn the nomenclature of the concept. He further requested that a representative of the Joint Chiefs of Staff come to the Pensacola, Florida, location of the movie Eagle's Wings, for assistance in putting militant liberty elements in the movie. 30 there, to help get the message across, was Marion Cooper, who had fought against Pancho Villa and as an Army flyer had been shot down over France by the Germans in 1918. Becoming a producer with RKO in the 1930s, he was responsible for teaming Fred Astaire with Ginger Rogers. Also on the set of Eagle's Wings was Ward Bond, president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization dedicated to running communists out of the industry and to aiding the House Un-American Activities Committee, UAC. Bond said one acquaintance would do anything that made him feel important, even at the expense of stomping on people. Ford, who was himself disgusted by McCarthy's blacklists, used to say, "Let's face it, Ward Bond is a shit, but he's our favorite shit." Here was the Hollywood Consortium at work, made up of a group of men who had known each other for decades and who looked to one another for authorization and support. Militant liberty could only have happened in an America so conscious of a sense of imperial burden. Articulating the imperatives and sacrifices of the Pax Americana, these films celebrated duty, the group, the response to command, the dominance of male derring-do. It was in this context that John Wayne, who went to extraordinary lengths to avoid military service in the Second World War, came to be regarded as the model of an American soldier, the personification of Americanism. The Duke was the frontier man taming the world. In 1979, Congress struck a medal in his honor. The inscription read simply, "John Wayne, America." But his was the America of red baiting and ethnic prejudice. As the eponymous hero in Big Jim McLean, 1952, he starred in one of the crudest B-film expressions of commie hating. The film was made as a tribute to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Movies, like propaganda, trade in fiction, but if this fiction is adroitly manufactured, it will be taken for reality. To perform this function well, Hollywood had long understood the need to cut its mythical patterns to suit the prevailing political and social mood. Thus, it had switched from making anti-Bolshevik films in the 1920s and 1930s to glorifying Russia as a wartime ally in films such as The North Star, Days of Glory, Song of Russia, and the notorious Mission to Moscow, which had actually whitewashed the Moscow trials and praised the Russians as defenders of democracy, to producing a rash of anti-communist films in the 1950s, The Red Nightmare, The Red Menace, Invasion USA, I Was a Communist for the FBI, Red Planet Mars, Iron Curtain, My Son John, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Walk East on Beacon Street, which was scripted and financed by the FBI, was J. Edgar Hoover's personal favorite. Their titles as unconvincing as their plots. These films all revealed a neurotic obsession with the outsider, the unknown, the other. Just as Captain America had switched from battling Nazis to battling communists, the attitude of American films towards Germany changed radically, the vanquished enemy now portrayed as heroic fighters and worthy opponents. Rommel the Desert Fox, 1952, The Sea Chase, 1955, The Enemy Below, 1957. As Monday's enemies be Tuesday's friends, Hollywood showed how easily it could rip off the good and evil labels from one nation and paste them onto another. 31. While such films played well to a domestic audience, enthralled to exaggerated claims of the communist menace, most Americans were now convinced that the Russians were coming and the bomb would soon fall in the night. 32. In the international market, they were poor performers. For a Europe still wounded by the memories of fascism, the insensate hatred and verbal violence of Hollywood's anti-communist offerings were unattractive in the extreme. Faring better were Disney's cartoons and feel-good films such as Roman Holiday and The Wizard of Oz. But not all Europeans were seduced by these fictive paradises. Buried deep in the clauses of successive trade agreements, starting with the Bloom-Burns Accord of 1946, were provisions which guaranteed an increase in the quota of American films shown in countries such as France. Such agreements were met with indignant criticism in French intellectual circles, and even, in 1948, led to violent street battles. American strategists were surprisingly slow to respond to widespread resentment in Europe at the saturation levels of Hollywood imports. There was no diplomatic representation at the 1951 Cannes Film Festival, nor any formal delegation of American motion picture leaders, writers, technicians, or artists. By contrast, the Russians had sent their deputy minister of cinema, as well as the renowned director Pudovkine, who gave a brilliant resume of Soviet achievements. After receiving reports that America had looked very silly at Cannes, the U.S. government resolved to give the motion picture industry more attention. On the 23rd of April 1953, after his appointment as special consultant to the government on cinema, Cecil B. DeMille strode into C.D. Jackson's office. Writing to Henry Luce 2 weeks later, C.D. said DeMille is very much on our side and is quite rightly impressed with the power of American films abroad. He has a theory, to which I subscribe completely, that the most effective use of American films is not to design an entire picture to cope with a certain problem, but rather to see to it that in a normal picture, the right line, aside, inflection, eyebrow movement is introduced. He told me that any time I could give him a simple problem for a country or an area, he would find a way of dealing with it in a picture. 33, DeMille's acceptance of a consultancy with the Motion Picture Service was a coup for government propagandists. Working through 135 United States Information Service posts in 87 countries, the MPS had a huge distribution network to hand. Awash with government funds, it was effectively a producer, with all the facilities available to a production company. It employed producer-directors who were given top security clearance and assigned to films which articulated the objectives which the United States is interested in obtaining and which could best reach the predetermined audience that we as a motion picture medium must condition. 34. It advised secret bodies like the Operations Coordinating Board on films suitable for international distribution. In June 1954, it listed 37 films for showing behind the Iron Curtain, including Peter Pan, The Jolson Story, The Glenn Miller Story, The Boy from Oklahoma, Roman Holiday, Little Women, Showboat, The Caine Mutiny, Go Man, Go, A History of the Harlem Globetrotters, Alice in Wonderland, and Executive Suite. The MPS also regulated American participation in film festivals abroad, thus filling the embarrassing vacuum of the 1951 Cannes Festival. Naturally, it worked hard to exclude American motion picture producers and films which do not support American foreign policy, which in some cases are harmful 35, from being shown at international festivals. Instead, it pushed films like The Bob Mathias Story, Allied Artists, 1954, an almost perfect portrayal of the best phase of American life. A small-town boy with his family, his sweetheart, his career, his interest in sports, all building up to his two-time triumph as one of the outstanding athletes in the history of the Olympics. If it hasn't got the American values we want on the screen, then we have got to start looking for a new set of values to publicize. 36. In the search for allies in Hollywood who best understood the propaganda problems of the U.S., and who were prepared to insert in their scripts and in their action the right ideas with the proper subtlety, C.D. Jackson, as usual, was embarrassed for choice. In January 1954, he set down a list of friends who could be expected to help the government: Cecil B. DeMille, Spiros P. Skouras, and Daryl Zanuck at Fox; Nicholas Schenck, president of MGM, and producer Dor Sherry; Barney Balaban, president of Paramount; Harry and Jack Warner; James R. Granger, president of RKO; Universal's president, Milton Rackmill; Columbia Pictures president, Harry Cohn; Herbert Yates at Republic; Walt and Roy Disney, and Eric Johnston of the Motion Picture Association. But CD's most valuable asset in Hollywood was CIA agent Carlton Alsop. Working undercover at Paramount Studios, Alsop had been a producer and agent working on the MGM lot in the mid-1930s, then with Judy Garland in the late 1940s and early 1950s, by which time he had already joined Frank Wisner's psychological warfare workshop. In the early 1950s, he authored regular movie reports for the CIA and the Psychological Strategy Board. These reports were compiled in response to a double need: first, to monitor communists and fellow travelers in Hollywood, and second, to summarize the achievements and failures of a covert pressure group headed up by Carlton Alsop, charged with introducing specific themes into Hollywood films. Alsop's secret reports make extraordinary reading. They reveal just how far the CIA was able to extend its reach into the film industry, despite its claims that it sought no such influence. One report, dated 24th of January 1953, concentrated on the problem of black stereotyping in Hollywood. Under the heading Negroes in Pictures, Alsop reported that he had secured the agreement of several casting directors to plant well-dressed Negroes as a part of the American scene, without appearing too conspicuous or deliberate. Sangaree, which is shooting, doesn't permit this kind of planting, unfortunately, because the picture is period and laid in the South. It will consequently show plantation Negroes. However, this is being offset to a certain degree by planting a dignified Negro butler in one of the principal's homes, and by giving him dialogue indicating he is a freed man and can work where he likes. 37. Alsop also reported that some Negroes will be planted in the crowd scenes in the comedy film Caddy, starring Jerry Lewis. At a time when many Negroes had as much chance of getting into a golf club as they had of getting the vote, this seemed optimistic indeed. 38. In the same report, Alsop referred to the film Arrowhead, which for once showed a readiness to question America's treatment of the Apaches. But this, said Alsop, presented a serious problem in that the commies could use it to their advantage. Happily, a little tinkering on his part ensured that most of the offending scenes, the shipment of a whole tribe of Apaches by the Army against their wishes to Florida, and the tagging of them like animals, had been removed or their impact significantly diluted. Other changes were achieved by redubbing lines of dialogue after the picture had already closed. Presented on a commercial and patriotic basis, Alsop encountered no opposition from the movie's producer, Nat Holt, 39. The Soviets never lost an opportunity to underline America's poor record in race relations. In 1946, James Burns, Truman's Secretary of State, found himself stumped and defeated when he attempted to protest Soviet denial of voting rights in the Balkans, only to find the Soviets replying, rightly, that the Negroes of Mr. Burns' own state of South Carolina were denied the same right. 40 Alsop's efforts in Hollywood were part of a broader campaign to discredit Soviet claims about American discrimination, low pay, unequal justice, and violence against African Americans. For his part, C.D. Jackson wanted to confront the issue head-on and argued that it is time we stop explaining in terms of this dreadful blot on our scutcheon and look the whole world in the eye. 41. To this end, psychological warfare experts on the Operations Coordinating Board, in close collaboration with the State Department, established a secret cultural presentation committee whose chief activity was to plan and coordinate tours of Black American artists. The appearance on the international stage of Leontine Price, Dizzy Gillespie, Marian Anderson, William Warfield, the Martha Graham Dance Troupe, and a host of other multiracial and Black American talent during this period was part of this covertly supervised export program. As was the extended tour of what one covert strategist described as the Great Negro Folk Opera, Porgy and Bess, which traveled through Western Europe, South America, and then the Soviet bloc for more than a decade, its cast of 70 African Americans, living demonstration of the American Negro as part of America's cultural life. 42, curiously, the rise of this Black American talent was in direct proportion to the demise of those writers who had first given voice to the poor status of Blacks in American society. In 1955, the Russian magazine Inostrannaya Literatura, Foreign Literature, carried 2 short stories by Erskine Caldwell, which caused American propagandists to choke on their breakfast. The first story is entitled Crazy Money, originally published in English as The Windfall, and it is innocuous, wrote John Pauker of the United States Information Agency, USIA. The second story, however, is vicious. It is entitled Masses of Men and deals with corporate knavery, Negro poverty, and the rape of a 10-year-old girl for 25 cents. 43. The USIA's concern was taken up by the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which promised to pressurize Caldwell into publicly disclaiming the story. Echoing Sidney Hook's complaints of 1949 that Southern writers reinforced negative perceptions of America, with their novels of social protest and revolt and American degeneracy and inanity, 44, the American Committee now resolved to steer clear of incestuous Southerners. Their work gives an exceedingly partial and psychologically colored account of our manners and morals. 45. This was no isolated judgment, but one taken up by many cultural cold warriors, including Eric Johnston, who led the assault on the Southerners from his office in Hollywood. We'll have no more Grapes of Wrath. We'll have no more Tobacco Roads. We'll have no more films that show the seamy side of American life. 46. Sales of books by Caldwell, Steinbeck, Faulkner, and Richard Wright, the Sepia Steinbeck, slumped in this period. Back in Hollywood, Carlton Alsop was ever alert to portrayals of American seediness. In one report, he warned of a screenplay based on a novel called Giant by Edna Ferber. This, he said, was one to watch because it touches upon the following 3 problems. 1. Unflattering portrayal of rich, uncouth, ruthless Americans, Texans. 2. Racial denigration of Mexicans in Texas. 3. Implication wealth of Anglo-Texans built by exploiting Mexican labor. Alsop's solution was simple. I'll see to it that it is killed each time someone tries to reactivate it at Paramount. 47. He was only partially successful. Warner Brothers, not Paramount, made the film James Dean's Last in 1956. Alsop's reports continued to measure the political temperature in Hollywood, detailing the intricate job of nursing producers and studios into accepting what the CIA labeled its Hollywood formula. 48 out came the negative stereotypes, and came the characterizations which represented a healthy America. Have succeeded in removing American drunks, generally in prominent, if not principal roles, from the following pictures, announced Alsop. Houdini, drunken American reporter, cut entirely. This may need a retake to correct. Legend of the Incas, removed all heavy drinking on part of American lead from script. Elephant Walk, keeping drunkenness to strict plot purposes only. Leininger and the Ants, All heavy drinking by American lead is being cut out of script. 49 on the subject of pictures striking at religion. Alsop was especially sensitive. When one studio started developing the screenplay for D'Annunzio's Daughter of Iorio in collaboration with Alberto Moravia, Alsop was convinced it would be 100% anti-clerical and wondered, how can we stop this one? I suppose the Vatican should do something about it. Don't think I'm taking too much of a pro-Catholic attitude, which may be coloring my outlook. In this battle for the minds, the first step the commies must take is to debunk religion. 50 even more troubling was Roberto Rossellini's Francesco, Giullare di Dio, his treatment of the life of St. Francis. This is really something, Alsop wrote. You couldn't hope for a better picture debunking religion than this. Saint Francis and his companions are characterized in such an extreme, oversimplified manner that you get the feeling they are a bunch of nincompoops, not all there mentally, and some of them perhaps homosexuals. 51 Alsop had joined Wisner's OPC at the same time as Phineas Farr, a writer with Hollywood connections who had worked with John O'Hara. Recruited to the psychological warfare workshop, Alsop and Farr were run by Howard Hunt, a former OSSer whose taste for black propaganda, he later said he thought black, earned him a job running CIA training courses in political and psychological warfare. Shortly after George Orwell's death in 1950, Howard Hunt had dispatched Alsop and Farr to England to meet the author's widow, Sonia. They were not there to console her, but to invite her to sign over the film rights to Animal Farm. This she duly did, having first secured their promise that they would arrange for her to meet her hero Clark Gable. From this visit, wrote Howard Hunt, was to come the animated cartoon film of Orwell's Animal Farm, which the CIA financed and distributed throughout the world. 52. The rights having been acquired, Hunt set about securing a producer who could front for the CIA. He settled on Louis de Rochemont, who had employed Hunt when he made The March of Time, a series of monthly documentaries, of which Time Inc. was the parent corporation, 53. In liaison with Hunt, and using CIA funds injected by Alsop and Farr, de Rochemont began production of Animal Farm on the 15th of November, 1951. Chosen to make the most ambitious animation film of its time, 80 cartoonists, 750 scenes, 300,000 drawings in color, was the British firm of Hallas and Batchelor Cartoon Films Ltd. Hungarian-born John Hallas had come to England in 1936 and worked on Music Man, the first English cartoon in Technicolor. Teaming up with his wife, Joy Batchelor, he produced over 100 government films for the British Central Office of Information, many of which helped publicize the Marshall Plan and NATO. Animal Farm publisher Frederick Warburg took a keen interest in the Hallas production and kept his friends in the Congress for Cultural Freedom briefed on its progress. He visited the studio several times in 1952-3 to view sequences and to add his suggestions for script changes. Perhaps it was Warburg who suggested that the old major, the prophet of the revolution, should be given the voice and appearance of Winston Churchill. At the same time, he was overseeing a new edition of Animal Farm, to be published by Seeker and Warburg, with stills from the Hallas and Batchelor production. The screenplay was also scrutinized by the Psychological Strategy Board. According to a memo of 23rd of January 1952, its officers were yet to be convinced by the script, finding its theme somewhat confusing and the impact of the story as expressed in cartoon sequence somewhat nebulous. Although the symbolism is apparently plain, there is no great clarity of message. 54 curiously, the critique of America's intelligence bureaucrats echoed the earlier concerns of T.S. Eliot and William Empson, both of whom had written to Orwell in 1944 to point out faults or inconsistencies in the central parable of Animal Farm. The script problems were resolved by changing the ending. In the original text, communist pigs and capitalist man are indistinguishable, merging into a common pool of rottenness. In the film, such congruity was carefully elided. Pilkington and Frederick, central characters whom Orwell designated as the British and German governing classes, are barely noticeable, and in the ending, simply eliminated. In the book, the creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, but already it was impossible to say which was which. Viewers of the film, however, saw an altogether different denouement, where it is the sight of the pigs which impels the other watching animals to mount a successful counter-revolution by storming the farmhouse. By removing the human farmers from the scene, to leave only the pigs reveling in the fruits of exploitation, the conflation of communist corruption with capitalist decadence was reversed. Even greater liberties were proposed when the CIA turned to Orwell's later work, 1984. Orwell died before making over the film rights, but by 1954, they ended up in the hands of producer Peter Rathbun. Rathbun, a good friend of John Ford's, had been president of RKO until he was ousted by Howard Hughes in 1949. That year, he formed the Motion Picture Capital Corporation, which was engaged in motion picture production and financing. The corporation, and Rathbun himself, enjoyed a close relationship with the U.S. government, financing films for the Motion Picture Service. According to Lawrence de Neufville, Howard Hunt solicited Rathbun's collaboration in the film version of Orwell's classic. Through Rathbun's corporation, government money was made available to start production on the film 55, which appeared in 1956, starring Edmund O'Brien, Jan Sterling, and Michael Redgrave. Orwell's nightmare vision of the future in 1984 appealed to cultural strategists on a number of levels. CIA and Psychological Strategy Board officers, for whom the book was required reading, seized on its examination of the dangers of totalitarianism, ignoring the fact that Orwell was inveighing against the abuses that all controlling states, whether of the right or left, exercise over their citizens. But from being a kind of game, what Orwell termed his little list took on a new and sinister dimension when he volunteered it to the IRD, a secret arm, as Orwell knew, of the Foreign Office. Although the IRD's Adam Watson would later claim that its immediate usefulness was that these were not people who should write for us, he also revealed that their connections with Soviet-backed organizations might have to be exposed at some later date. 68. In other words, once in the hands of a branch of government whose activities were not open to inspection, Orwell's list lost any innocence it may have had as a private document. It became a dossier with very real potential for damaging people's reputations and careers. 50 years later, Orwell's authorized biographer Bernard Crick stood firmly by Orwell's action, claiming it was no different from responsible citizens nowadays, passing on information to the anti-terrorist squad about people in their midst whom they believed to be IRA bombers. These were seen as dangerous times in the late 40s. 69. This defense has been echoed by those determined to perpetuate the myth of an intellectual group bound by their ties to Moscow and united in a seditious attempt to prepare the ground for Stalinism in Britain. There is no evidence that anybody on Orwell's list, as far as it has been made public, was involved in any illegal undertaking, and certainly nothing which would justify the comparison to Republican terrorists. Homosexual was the only indictment which bore any risk of criminal conviction, though this does not seem to have deterred Orwell in his bestowal of the word. British law did not prohibit membership of the Communist Party, being Jewish, being sentimental, or stupid. So far as the right is concerned, Orwell can do no wrong, Peregrine Worsthorne has written. His judgment in these matters is trusted absolutely. So if he thought the Cold War made it justifiable for one writer to be positively eager to shop another, then that is that. End of argument. But it shouldn't be the end of argument. A dishonorable act does not become honorable just because it was committed by George Orwell. 70. This is not to say that Orwell was wrong to be concerned about what he called the poisonous effect of the Russian mythos on English intellectual life. 71. He of all people knew the cost of ideology and the distortions performed in its name by liberals who fear liberty and the intellectuals who want to do dirt on the intellect. 72. But by his actions, he demonstrated that he had confused the role of the intellectual with that of the policeman. As an intellectual, Orwell could command an audience for his attacks on British Russomania openly by engaging his opponents in debate on the pages of Tribune, Polemic, and other magazines and papers. In what way was the cause of freedom advanced by answering, suspected, intellectual dishonesty with subterfuge? If I had to choose a text to justify myself, I should choose the line from Milton, "By the known rules of ancient liberty." Orwell wrote in the preface to Animal Farm, The phrase, he explained, referred to his strong faith in the deep-rooted tradition of intellectual freedom, without which our characteristic Western culture could only doubtfully exist. He followed with a quote from Voltaire, "I detest what you say. I will defend to the death your right to say it." 73 months before his own death, Orwell seemed to be saying, "I detest what you say. I will defend to death your right to say it, but not under any circumstances." Commenting on what she saw as Orwell's move to the right, Mary McCarthy remarked it was a blessing he died so young.